Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is my co-host, Neil Riddell. Neil, what are we going to be talking about today?
Today we have a guest who has started trying to sell electric cars before there were electric cars to sell. And he sells them to businesses, and we're going to dive into the world of David Watts and what he's been up to. Hey, David, welcome to the show.
Hi, Neil. Hi, Chris. Great to be here.
So the very simple, straightforward question to get us rolling is, David, what do you do and who do you sell it to?
Well, what I do right now is I'm the fleet product manager for electric vehicles for Volkswagen Financial Services fleet. Very quickly. So I interact with corporate businesses on their transition to electrification.
And can we have a definition of fleet? I make a lot of time with my customers, my stakeholders to go, listen, fleet's a bit ambiguous. You know, it's got multiple different definitions. What do you define a fleet as?
Sure. So, and this is one of my sort of soapboxes that I get on a bit about our industry and the media, and because we generically use the word fleet in many contexts, and no one ever actually really knows what you're talking about. So in my world, fleet is company cars and company vans, as opposed to buses and trucks, and that's the world I've been in for sort of 27 years in that sense. So yeah, so company cars and vans, vehicles that are provided to employees.
And I know from having spoken to you about this before that we like to classify company cars a couple of different ways. Do you want to break down company car fleets?
Yeah, sure. So there are essentially two types of company cars. There's those that are provided as part of a benefits policy, where typically the driver has a choice of vehicle. Now that may be two vehicles or maybe 200 vehicles, but they get a degree of choice. And then there's operational cars where the driver gets no choice, and they're typically sort of engineers, technicians, that type of thing, and they're all given the exact same car, a silver estate car with some branding on maybe, and that as a population, whilst the vehicles are they're more capable from an electrification perspective, the transition process to EV is much more like a van fleet than it is a sort of choice-based company car fleet.
Now, I recently lived in Europe for a number of years, and I looked to buy a used automobile. I went to the automobile dealerships, and you could see the different cars you just described in the used market. Is there something happening with EVs and tipping point in your calculations that at a certain point, an internal combustion engine car is going to be less valuable on the market? And is that starting to weigh into the buy decision because of legislation in a number of countries in Europe when internal combustion engines go away?
At the moment, everything is being driven by total cost of ownership or a whole life cost sort of methodology, whereby they're taking into account a number of factors from the purchase, depreciation, financing, along with then servicing and the running costs of the vehicle around sort of business mileage costs. So at the moment, there's a sort of balance piece. There's an obsession with will EVs save you money, and that really doesn't matter. It's actually will EVs cost you the same as what you're currently driving. So at the moment, it's a very balanced piece as to whether an EV is more cost effective or less cost effective than the equivalent vehicle. Some of that is driven by taxation. Because of certainly in the UK, there's extremely favourable company car taxation, which has a corporate tax element to it as well, and that's really the big piece that is making electric cars very cost effective against their petrol or diesel equivalents. And certainly in the UK, we've lost sort of the grant scheme that is which still is around in other countries, but certainly at the moment we've lost that sort of ceased to be. So the cost benefits are a lot harder to find, shall we say?
Got it. And now you're working with a financial services for fleets or fleets. So when you're negotiating or working with your customers, is it done per the fleet that you're looking at? So the class of vehicle, or are you funding just like when an individual buys a car, each individual vehicle?
So as a business, we do everything from a personal contract hire, personal lease agreement, right through to international corporate leasing. So my role is specifically focusing on larger fleets and the relevant people within that, and that could be company car fleets and vans and both. It's a whole mix of things, really.
And you're obviously speaking to a lot of businesses at the moment. We've been through, and we still are going through, a relatively tight economic period. What's the general attitude towards the electrification of these vehicles? Is it positive? Have we got some good signs, or is it a challenging environment in which to talk to business customers?
It's both. Still, it's better than it used to be. Having been doing this for a very long time, from a car perspective, from a company car perspective, it's a lot easier because of the tax benefits available to the drivers and equally to the company for it. It's a much more positive conversation than it used to be. That being said, there are plenty of businesses that are still yet to even dip their toe in the water. From a commercial vehicle perspective, vans, it's a lot harder because they're a lot more complex in terms of that transition process. So we're seeing some that are well ahead of the game and others that are really struggling with the concept and at the moment just sort of putting the brakes on.
So you describe it as complex for commercial vehicles. Could you give us a bit more detail as what some of those complexities look like? Why is it hard?
So it's primarily because the business has to essentially address all the difficulties that come with taking an electric vehicle, and have to address that for the driver. Whereas when a driver makes their own personal choice to take an electric vehicle, they've covered those issues off themselves. Commercial vehicles also then have the slight downside of being, should we say, less capable from an electrification perspective in terms of the very basic piece of range. They have significantly less range than the average car, and that makes life that bit more complicated in terms of how and where you're going to charge these vehicles. A lot of commercial vehicles go home with the driver every night, but they don't necessarily sit on somebody's driveway. And so therefore you do have to, they will have to, and even if they did sit on somebody's driveway, you can't make the assumption that employee is going to be able to charge your vehicle for them for a variety of reasons. So figuring out the charging process and to ensure your vehicles do the job, because any time that the vehicle is not running, shall we say, it's effectively costing the business money if it's not being operational.
So on those difficulties that you kind of skirted over, I can hear charging is clearly sat amongst them. What are the other things that companies come to you and say, listen, this is too hard because?
From a commercial vehicle perspective, it's depending on the type of vehicle they're looking at. Payload is a big issue, particularly in the larger van segment. In the smaller and medium van segments, is less so. But once you're starting to get into large vans, and we're talking sort of 3.5 ton vehicles, payload becomes a real problem. Large vans aren't particularly energy efficient, whether electric or diesel, and so therefore they need bigger batteries in order to be able to achieve the same sort of capability as a smaller van. But of course, a bigger battery, you then have this essentially three-way problem of the gross vehicle weight of the vehicle, the range you want the vehicle to be able to achieve, and then the weight of the battery and the payload that's implicated in there. So if you're putting more batteries in, you're getting a heavier gross vehicle weight, and therefore your payload starts to drop. So, and in that large van segment, people typically want a sort of at least a ton's worth of payload. But if you've got a very large battery in there, you're really starting to sort of have a real hit on your potential payload.
But I guess this conversation is making the assumption battery and as opposed to hydrogen or something else. So my understanding is that each segment, there's probably a proper tool for the job, right? So I don't know that, lithium ion batteries maybe work in the biggest of lorries, right? So are you seeing that, or is that still kind of experimental in hydrogen infrastructure, green hydrogen infrastructure, not there yet?
So hydrogen versus EV is it's a whole podcast in itself, I think.
No, but I was just saying not EV per se for employees taking home at night. That probably makes sense to be an EV in my humble opinion. But when you're starting to talk bigger vans, are you still considering electrification or electrification through maybe a hydrogen fuel cell?
At the moment, we're still, to some extent, it's where is the money? and what are the manufacturers doing? And at the moment, they're focusing on EV. There's some toying around the edges, shall we say, with some hydrogen product, but in principle, we're not seeing any scale production plans of hydrogen vehicles in the van segment. So on that basis, then we have to assume that that's where the plan is going. So therefore, electrification is the way forward. But some of those problems and challenges that we have with electric vans get resolved as battery technology improves, because this is about energy density in essence. If you can get more energy for the same weight of battery, then clearly those payload issues become less of a problem, and you've then got extra range and everything else. So, but also coupled with, if you look at pretty much most, if not all, of the vans that are available today, they're all essentially converted vans. They're all petrol and they're all diesel vans that have been turned into electric. And that architecture of a van essentially limits how much battery you can put in anyway, just physically. So on those larger vans, one of the reasons why they've got limited range, and this doesn't solve the payload piece, is because they can only put so much battery in. If you look at those large vans, they're all typically around about 70, 75 kilowatts. And there's got to be a reason for that, and one assumes it's because they can't actually crowbar any more in. The next generation of vans that we'll see coming over the next few years should hopefully therefore be vans designed as electric vehicles from the ground up, which gives you a better platform to put more batteries in. There's a rule in a legislation change in the UK, which actually means you can drive a 4.25 ton van on a 3.5 ton license, which makes life a lot easier, which therefore gives you an extra 750 kilos, which suddenly puts you into the right payload space that you would be normally running on a diesel van. So when you start to combine these things together, the future is looking better.
So it's great to see that we're discussing some of the nuance of regulation and how it's impacting the transition. If we go back a little bit and look at things that have been successful so far, and maybe we'll go forward around what you want to recommend. But if we look back, you touched very briefly on some of the subsidies. Could you tell us a bit more about what, you've seen this transition happen? What is the role of subsidies? How can countries adapt subsidies to support early stages of the transition? And when do you remove them?
So subsidies and incentives change behaviour. I think that's the basic piece. And certainly when you're talking about tax incentives, they're extremely effective at changing behaviour, and we've seen that over the last 20 years in terms of getting people into lower carbon vehicles and ultimately into electric. Grants in terms of purchase discounts, if you like, they are effective, but perhaps less effective than tax. I think tax is a very strong measure. But certainly from a UK perspective, we've had right from the early days of EVs, we had a plug-in vehicle grant or a plug-in car grant. We've still got it on vans. There is a debate as to how much that grant should be, and in the early days, certainly on cars, it was quite significant. It gradually got phased out over time. And certainly from a UK perspective, we've now no longer got a plug-in car grant. The question of when you remove it essentially comes down to government finances, I think, in terms of who is getting the benefit from this, because you suddenly start to, it adds up very quickly when the growth in the market really starts to take off. So when we had the grant originally, you were talking sort of 20, 50,000 vehicles a year at the most. Now we're going to be touching 300,000 vehicles, well, quite easily breaking 300,000 cars this year. And so if you've got a grant, suddenly that scales up quite significantly. So the phasing out, arguably having a grant forever is a great thing, but the removal of it is because, essentially is a balance between how much money have you got to spend versus have you changed the behavior, and has the market already then shifted?
And I guess, so you're talking about grants, and another impact would be tax. So at least here in the US, I know our fuel taxes pay for things. And energy for a fleet could be a bit tricky, right? My tariff at home might be different than the tariff at a charging station versus what the company pays. So is there structure that goes into these fleets that the government or regulation is keeping up with the technology on the tax structure for the infrastructure?
Probably not. At the, as you say, the problem we have is essentially a price disparity or price discrimination, shall we say? So if you are lucky enough to be able to charge your vehicle up at home, and even if the business is paying for that, they're then getting the benefit of that. You can access off-peak tariff rates, overnight tariff rates, which are extremely cheap, which means you're still running your vehicle at around about 3 or 4, maybe 5 pence per mile, which is extremely cheap compared to 15, 20 plus pence per mile in a petrol diesel vehicle. Even on a standard home tariff rate, you're still looking at sort of 8 or 9 pence per mile. But as soon as you then move into the public domain and public charges, then you're seeing a significant increase in price. Sort of 25 pence a kilowatt, and perhaps up to 80 odd pence a kilowatt, which then ramps up the prices significantly. One of the key things that we have in the UK is we don't really have VAT on home electricity, but we do have VAT on public tariffs, which is 20%. So that there is a campaign in the UK about trying to tackle that, because that would be an easy mechanism from a legislation point of view to mitigate some of that pricing tariff discrimination, because there is a population. I mean, even if you sort of remove yourself from the fleet sort of question, there is a pricing discrimination and sort of a social discrimination around electrification in that sense, because people who can't charge up at home are therefore more likely to be in a lower income bracket, and therefore if they are being forced to charge up on the street, and therefore having to pay VAT, whereas arguably more wealthy people who can charge at home on their driveway. So there's a whole complicated piece which actually, if they tackle that VAT piece on public charging, would start to alleviate, wouldn't solve it, but it would alleviate a little bit.
So we spend a lot of time here at Power looking at tax and trying to help our customers with tax. We, talk about things like total cost of charging. When you use your public infrastructure, it's all the insurance, the hardware, the connection. It's all included. So there's some dynamic in this space around how you compare the pence per kilowatt hour rate from one place to another. I think what's interesting is when you open up debates around, the little bit of tax that you get on public charging versus home charging, we're trying to get into quite nuanced and subtle areas. It sounds to me like the easy thing for the government is to slap a big fat grant on top of a vehicle to reduce the cost and make it easier to buy. But then as you become a more sophisticated, step in your journey, you twiddle all these little edge incremental pieces. You talked earlier about vans, the costs, the challenges with battery size, etc. What can government do to incentivize more vans onto the streets? Because these are the guys that pollute the centre of cities. They clog up our roads, and breathing the diesel fumes of a van is not that pleasant. What can we do about vans?
So vans still do have a grant, a reasonable sized grant on the purchase price, but the van market itself is struggling to electrify, and I think it's more about the fact that it's a complicated transition process rather than necessarily the price. Fleet operators are well used to the idea of a total cost of ownership model, so they're comfortable with that from a van point of view, and the grant certainly helps that. I think the barrier is not necessarily purely price driven in that market. It's more about how do I do it, and to some extent. And when you look at a van fleet, you'll have a spectrum of vans that you could electrify relatively easily today, through to vans that are either extremely hard or actually probably impossible if you're trying to do a like-for-like replacement in terms of their operational requirements. And for me, there's a lot of fleets who are essentially focusing on the really hard stuff, or even the potentially impossible stuff, and getting distracted by that, and then just sort of freezing and just sort of getting paralyzed by the scale of the sort of the scale of the problem they're looking at, rather than going, actually, let's just break it down a bit. Yes, there is a part of my fleet, and it might be a lot of their fleet that is really hard. Let's just ignore those for the time being. Let's look at where we can physically electrify. And that might even just be one vehicle today where they can actually just sort of make a positive change, sort of get some learnings from it, and then gradually sort of work their way through. But I think it's this whole sort of build this transition strategy that they're struggling with. They just fixate on the complications rather than going, right, let's just break it down into manageable chunks, and let's work our way through it, and not worry about the really hard stuff. We'll get to them in a few years' time, but let's focus on what we can change rather than what we can't change.
So who do you see transitioning first?
So, we're seeing some big fleets who are making some really big changes, and they're actually sort of in more the sort of utility sector. Arguably, depot-based fleets, back-to-base vehicles are more suited to it, just purely because it resolves one of the problems, i.e. how do you charge the vehicle? So on the assumption the vehicle can do its operational job on one charge, or even if it can't do it on one charge, but actually, if you're starting with the sort of the easy ones, they're the vehicles that their daily profile is within the electric capability or the electric range capability of the van. If it's back to base, then you're in charge of the infrastructure. You haven't got to worry about public charging. You haven't got to worry about home charging, whether the driver could actually physically charge it at home or anything like that. It's back to base. You can manage that piece. So then becomes about the operational use of the vehicle. Now, there is a bigger question of the electrifying the depot, and when we talk about complications, that's a big complication because you suddenly got to go, right, we've got X number of vehicles, we've got 10 vehicles on our site, they need this amount of power to enable them to do their job. We need the power at this time of the day. How do we get that power into our site? Have we got enough power to start off with? And if we haven't, how do we get that power? And what's that going to cost to do that sort of infrastructure upgrade?
So I get the cost structure. Is the desire to be there? You said earlier in the interview that it was an economic decision for most, right? It was basically they're looking at the total cost of ownership. It wasn't one or the other. I think what I understood you say, it was kind of, do the economics allow us to make this choice? So what's driving the decision to even look at the choice? Or is it sustainability that companies are looking at, or is there an economic decision that's saying we do it, or it's legislation that's pushing them to do it? Why, if it's so complicated, are they going through the brain damage? I mean, obviously, you can say carbon or output that, that we've had the conversation, but they have shareholders in a business they're trying to run. So what's driving it for your customers?
So I think it's all of the above to some extent. So I think the need to be seen to be doing something sustainable. Do I believe that the average corporate business is genuinely sustainably motivated? Having been involved in this for the best part of 20 years, I struggle with that sometimes. But they need to be seen to be taking a sustainability route. So and that's increasingly important. And when you look at tenders for business, whatever it is that you do, if you're tendering for business and trying to win business, you increasingly have to demonstrate your environmental credentials. There's a growing piece of actually showing your environmental credentials to your employees and demonstrating that you're an ethical and sustainable business. So I think sustainability is a lot more important than it ever used to be, compared to 5-10 years ago. It's a lot more important. Do they actually believe it? I don't know, but it is important for their business to be seen to be pushing a sustainability agenda. The economics are really important because that's when because fundamentally you have to put a business case together to say, right, we are going to go down this road. So there are businesses who are willing to pay to achieve something. There are others who will sit there and go, well, it costs too much, therefore there's a limit to what we can do at this point in the process. However, if we start to look a little bit further down the line, EVs are going to be the only things you can buy, essentially. Now, whether in the UK we had an EV target for 2030 in terms of manufacturing, or in terms of vehicles being sold, that's just been pushed back to 2035. It remains to be seen whether it gets brought forward again over the next, if we get another government. But either way, in the next 10-ish years, you're going to be really struggling to get a petrol or diesel vehicle. Because we have a mandate, if nothing else, that will drive the proportion of EVs that are being sold in the country. So it is being government focused in terms of government forced. There is a sustainability element to it, but fundamentally it has to be cost effective for most. There are very few organisations who are willing to pay for the privilege of being able to be more sustainable, I think.
So you can see that these businesses are making quite important decisions to bring what is effectively new vehicles into their fleet. And in doing so, the ICE goes out, the EV comes in. I recently got asked a question about how many of the new vehicles coming into the market were being taken by businesses. And I seem to remember the number was quite high. How long do these businesses hold on to those vehicles? What does this mean for the market? What's the role of businesses in purchasing new electric vehicles?
So typically, business-related new vehicle registration, so new car registrations, has always been around about sort of 50 to 60% of all new car registrations have been business-related in some format or other. From a van point of view, it's more like 95, 99%. Virtually all vans are bought by businesses as opposed to sort of a retail purchase. But then when we look at EV, that proportion is significantly higher. And particularly this year with the sort of cost of living situation we've had over the past 12 months or so, it's really slowed the retail market, the new car retail market for electric cars. So I don't know the exact number, but it's certainly a very high percentage of all the new EVs are business related in terms of registrations. From a car point of view, cars are typically kept for between 3 and 4 years from a corporate perspective, and a van is probably slightly longer, more like 4 to 5 years. So if you think about the fact that actually most EVs have only really sort of come to market since 2020, and therefore we're at the back end of 2023. The volume of EVs that are in the market, in the used car market, are obviously going to be still relatively low, but they're now starting to ramp up as all those first vehicles that came through in 2020 are now starting to sort of filter into the market. From a van point of view, though, there is a sort of slight dilemma about, or not dilemma really, but there's a question about how long do you keep a van for. So typically, businesses will keep them for 4 to 5 years. 80 to 100,000 miles, and then you get rid of them. And one of the reasons why you get rid of them is because once you're hitting that 80,000 mile mark in a diesel vehicle, your maintenance costs really start to ramp up. That's not the case in principle for EVs. Arguably, your maintenance costs are pretty much plateaued for the whole time you own it, with the exception of the sporadic times that you replace your tyres. And if you work on the basis that actually the van TCO, the van total cost of ownership, is a little bit more challenging and to make it cost effective or just to balance it out. So there is an argument to say, well, actually, if you haven't got the same maintenance issues on a 6 or a 7-year or an 8-year-old van as you had on a diesel van, and you're struggling to make the total cost of ownership balance again, it's not about saving money, it's just about balancing against your existing diesel vehicles. Well, if you run that electric vehicle for longer, then you're spreading that cost, and actually that's a way to get it to balance out. Now, that will ultimately, so if that's where the market goes, then that has a knock-on effect to the used van market, because there's still a very large used van market out there, because all these vehicles are coming back after 4 or 5 years. So there is a risk there that your second buyers, probably your plumbers and your decorators, your sort of single owner businesses, independent sort of businesses, they will potentially struggle to access a vehicle if they're in that market until longer. So they will be running diesel vans for that bit longer.
So has this dramatically changed the way you do your job? You've been selling fleets for some period of time. You've been doing the business case for companies for a long time. You work in that industry. So, what's different about your day to day job now that we're talking EVs?
Um, it's different that there are now some available. So when I first started talking so I don't sell cars as such. I sell the idea of electrification. So I don't physically go and sell. I'm not a car salesperson in that sense, but I work for automotive companies to help sell the idea of decarbonisation and electrification. But when I first started this 17 years ago, if you the choice of electric vehicles, was limited, shall we say. So if you bear in mind the Nissan Leaf, which was arguably the first mainstream family-size car that sort of had a respectable mileage, albeit that realistically was only 50 to 80 miles at best. That was 2010. So I was talking to fleets about how to electrify before the Nissan Leaf was launched. So, which does make me laugh because people say, "Oh, it's really hard to electrify," and actually, well, you should have tried having that conversation 15 years ago, when the infrastructure was barely existed and the vehicles didn't exist. So, so the difference that's happened now is that there are vehicles available. The taxation system in the UK for company cars changed overnight, or rather, the incentive that was put in place in 2020 changed overnight the attitude and the willingness to look at electric vehicles. Because essentially it made it free from a company car tax perspective. So the driver, if they were taking a company car as an EV in 2020, they paid zero tax, which suddenly made it extremely attractive. You're about to ask something there, Chris. You're poised to ask.
Yeah. So I was about to say something. And so I get the zero tax, and I get it. I know also, even going through the diesel experience living in Europe, that cities were refining what generation diesel you could drive into around the EU. Now, as we transition to EVs in the UK, at least, have any cities started mandating maybe vans or fleets need to be zero emissions yet? Is that on the radar, or are there legislation proposed to do that at the city level or the regional level?
It's on the radar, but I think it's on a very long distance radar. So we have a thing called the clean air zones, which a number of towns and cities have signed up to. But that essentially, from an air quality perspective, the rules around clean air zones are, in terms of being compliant and not facing a fine, is Euro 6 diesel and Euro 4 for petrol. And now Euro 6 for diesel was, I think, 2015 for cars and 2016 for vans. So in terms of being mandated. So from a fleet perspective, clean air zones essentially have no impact whatsoever. Now, for retail buyers and potentially sort of small businesses, very small businesses that run older vehicles, then they are potentially being impacted. The only place where there's a genuine zero emission zone is in the centre of Oxford. It's a very small area that was introduced a little while ago. To great contentious feedback, but essentially it's half a dozen streets right in the centre of Oxford. It's taken, where are we now? 2023. It's taken so the clean air zone framework, which was the rules that the government set out in terms of a city wanted to introduce a clean air zone, which I say is all about Euro 6 and Euro 4. That was introduced in 2015. So it's taken years for most local authorities, most towns and cities, to actually bring in any form of clean air zone which doesn't impact that many people. To then take that step to a zero emission zone is a huge step. And if we think clean air zones are difficult, a CAZ, as they call them, a zero emission zone would be catastrophically difficult to introduce in any sort of large area. It'll be something they can consider in, well, I guess it depends on how quickly EVs grow in that sense. But inevitably, something like that is only ever going to penalise the less well off. So it becomes a real social discrimination piece again. So it's a very difficult, very contentious piece to go down. So we're not seeing it. So I say it will definitely be on the radar, but it's going to be definitely a long distance radar.
Got it.
So beyond just the cities setting very restrictive zones, what else do you see in the future for EV? Where do you see this, if you were to look back in another 17 years' time, what kind of things would you be considering in that period happening?
Well, there's a question. We'll all be driving EVs. Yay. They'll have become normalized finally, which would be a start. I mean, even then, 17 years isn't actually that long in the great scheme of things in terms of you think about the actual transition, because there are only 2 million new cars every year. We're still a long way from being 100% EV of all our new cars. So in 17 years' time, the actual car park of our 30 million cars will still probably be only just about 50% EV at that point. I think autonomous is the real big change player, which EV allows us to do in a much more easily way. So that's going to grow. I don't think from an EV perspective anything is going to significantly change, other than the technology is going to be a world away from what we're looking at today, and that's again helps the sort of fleet transition piece, because everyone says, all the sort of EV, anti-EV sort of they fixate on the problems that we have today. But if you look back 5 years, if you look back 10 years, you look at how far we've come, and if you then extrapolate that forward 5, 10, 15 years, the technology that we're looking at today and what it's capable of, the energy density of batteries, the batteries in 2030 are not going to be the same batteries that we've got today. They're going to be completely different, made out of different materials. Will we still, in 17 years' time, will we still be using lithium-ion batteries? I mean, that's questionable. Will we be going down sodium-ion or something else? Which all start to, if they can make those technologies cost-effective, then it starts to transform the transition piece for business and for individuals, because a key bit about some of that development is about bringing prices down and making it more cost effective and more affordable for all. So that'll be the big change around EVs, is just battery chemistry and technology.
I love your answer to this question, because you started by saying 17 years wasn't that long, and then you gave us a list of all the things that could change in that period. And it does actually make you think that the rate of transition is quite impressive. You've taken us on a cool journey through some of the subsidies, tax incentives, definition of fleet. I loved your point about businesses potentially being paralyzed by the scale of the problem, and therefore their ability to start small. So I'd like to say thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been fabulous to go on this journey with you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this interview with David. It's been a fantastic conversation. Don't forget to follow us. Check this out on YouTube, and we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy EV series. Bye-bye for now.